Welcome everyone to SDM's Biblical Studies Seminar, and we have this spot once in 6 months, and so we're very glad for you to join us. And today we have a very distinguished speakers among us who will be presenting their papers. The first section will be the Old Testament section, and the second section will be the New Testament section. So before we dive in, just some housekeeping ish items. So as we go along, and if you have questions, we encourage you to drop those questions in written form in the chat box, and I will pick it up. We will have a short time for Q&A at the end of each section. So the way it goes will be that the speaker will present their paper. So the first to go is Dr. Seow, and then we will have the respondent respond to the paper. And then after that, we will have a short time of Q&A. And because time is so limited, we hope that you're able to draft your question beforehand and put it into the chat box, and we will pick it up during the Q&A time. And then we'll go into the NT section, and then it will follow the same flow. Before and there won't be a break during this session, so we'll go from OT to NT. So you'll have to take your own break in between. So before I dive in, let us open with a word of prayer. Most loving and gracious God, we thank you for bringing us together and also for bringing Asian scholarship and also our distinguished professors here today. We pray, O Lord, that as they present their papers, we will truly learn and be guided, O Lord, to read your word, O God, in fresh ways and in ways that could inspire us further to our own scholarship as well as our own exposition of your word. So be with us in our conversations today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today, who will be presenting an Old Testament paper. And this is distinguished professor Dr. Seow Chun Leong. Dr. Seow Chun Leong is currently resident in STM, but he will be leaving soon in a week's time. He is the emeritus professor at Vanderbilt University, where he is professor of Hebrew Bible. And Dr. Seow has studied the book of Job for many decades, and he is an expert in the book of Job. And today he will be presenting on the book of Job, and he is also well versed in ancient Near Eastern languages, and with that he has done great exposition on the book of Job. His most recent book-length publication, it's a long book, is the commentary on the book of Job, Job chapters 1 to 21, published by Eerdmans and the Illumination series. And we are eagerly awaiting the publication of volume 2, which he's working on with his indexes currently. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Seow, and the title of his paper is A Profound Worm Theology, Bildad as a Theologian of Tradition. Dr. Seow, all yours.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. I look forward to our conversation. So, of three friends of Job, Bildad always offers the most laconic speeches, as perhaps befits his moniker as the shortest man in the Bible. Bildad, the Shuhite. But even for Bildad, the Shuhite, Job 25 is an exceedingly brief speech. Yet this speech of only 5 verses has had a rich reception history. Oh, I'm not shared yet, have I? No, I have.
We are still
I
at
can I
slide
can
number
see the
one.
slide
Okay.
though. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
So first of all, there are several medieval Jewish piyutim, there's liturgical poems, alluding to the lowliness of humanity in verses 4 to 6, read in tandem with Eliphaz's view in 4:17 to 19 and 15:14 to 16. Among these is a composition by Elijah ben Shemaiah of Bari, Italy, who flourished during the 11th century. Recited as a part of a penitential liturgy, this piyut addresses God as judge of the human, a worm, quoting verse 6b. Pleading for divine mercy, the poet acknowledges that no human being can be right with God or pure before the deity. For interpreters in the early church, this passage was an indispensable text for Christian theological anthropology and soteriology. This exegesis goes back to Origen of Alexandria's lost homilies of Job in the 3rd century, which have been fragmentarily preserved in Latin translation by Hilary of Poitiers in the early 4th century in his Tractatus in Job, which quotes Bildad's speech as asserting the inherent depravity of humankind. Elsewhere, Hilary cites verse 4 of this passage to explain the curse of mortality for humankind in consequence of the fall. For the passage refers to the human as Yelud um, Hisha, born of a woman, understood to be an allusion to Eve. Augustine of Hippo would later quote Hilary and further develop this view of humanity's natural depravity. Augustine took verse 6, which refers to the mortal as rot, so in the LXX, and a worm, to mean the inevitable corrupt inevitably of a human body being corrupt. Every human born of woman, namely Eve, is incapable of doing good, a condition that can be rectified only through one born of a woman, the Virgin Mary. For Augustine, this was a proof text in his debate with the Pelagians regarding the inevitability of sin. Julian of Aclanum, Augustine's most formidable opponent in this debate, pointed out that Bildad was in fact conceding Job's dissociation of his suffering from any presumption of depravity. Now, Julian is on the mark in his exegesis in this regard, but Augustine's view prevailed as the orthodox position, which which will be upheld by Christians through Reformation and beyond. Another consequence of this of Bildad's speech is in Christian Christology. Christology. This derives from the rendering of MT Ben Adam in the Septuagint and Vulgate, Son of Man, said to be a worm. Christians, of course, Christians, of course, identified the Son of Man with Christ, and they associate this passage with the plaintive cry of Psalm 22, verse 7, I am a worm. And since Jesus on the cross uttered the opening words of the psalm, my God, why forsaken me? The image of the human as a worm thus becomes a metaphor for the incarnation. For Christians, the crucified Christ as the worm was the bait on a hook of divinity, which God had cast in the Jordan, where Jesus would be baptized, to lure and to deceive the dragon, that is the Leviathan, meaning the devil, who promptly swallowed it, thus resulting in the swallowing of death. To Bar Sanufius of Gaza in the 6th century, Christ the worm was the one who cleansed Job of the worm of corruption. This elaborate exegesis is evident in subsequent Christian art, as you see in this example of God fishing with the line comprising of like a rosary, all the saints in history culminating in Christ on the cross, who is the bait on hook of divinity by which Leviathan is captured. Ironically, despite the tendency among early Christians to dismiss Job's friends as heretics, Bildad's speech became an essential proof text in Christian dogmatic theology. The Hebrew text in verse 6 pairs the maggot and the worm, which interpreters understood to be metaphors of humanity's lowliness. Thus, Martin Luther speaks of the, speaks of maggot and worm as metaphors for human wretchedness, and he referred to himself as a stinking sack of maggots. This was for Christian a metaphor of lowliness, for the suffering servant was called a worm, and the abandoned sufferer, pious sufferer in Psalm 2, was a worm. This theology is evident in Isaac Watts' hymn, Alas, and Did My Saviour Bleed, composed in 1707. Watts marveled at the sacrifice of Christ on the cross for such a worm as I. This was a very popular hymn, has been a very popular hymn, especially in Korea. So perhaps not surprisingly, we get a reception of this passage in Korea, when novelist Yi Jong-jun wrote a story of a worm, a title derived from Job 25:6b, based on the Korean Revised Version. The story revolves around the suffering of a mother over the murder of a son and her unrelenting quest for justice. The arrest of the perpetrators brought her no assurance of justice. Comforted by a Christian friend who urged her to turn to God, she began to join a church and gave generously to the church as if to buy the outcome she desired. And yet, God did not answer her prayer. Skeptical that God would bring justice, she vowed that she herself would bring justice. Hence, like Job, she resorted to curses as a last resort to bring justice. But in time, she grew in faith to the point that she was ready to forgive the murderer. However, when she went to prison to announce her forgiveness of him, she was incensed to learn he had already repented of his sin and received God's forgiveness. God had cruelly deprived her of the opportunity to forgive, as her faith had required her to do. Indeed, in the eyes of God, she and the murderer are equal as sinners who equally deserve God's love. Like Job, she regarded God's equality towards the wicked and the pious as unjust. For Job, the injustice was death as an equalizer. For her, the injustice was the love of God as an equalizer. This divine equality was the ultimate betrayal for her. The lowly human creature who suffers is without recourse in the face of divine freedom. Poignantly, the protagonist is without a name, as is her husband, the anonymous narrator of the story, who says he is but a flawed and nameless individual. In fact, everyone else in the story is named. The murdered child has a name, the murderer has a name, the comforter has a name, but the sufferers who seem abandoned by God are nameless. They are as lowly as the worm in the title of the story. It was later made into a movie, Mil Yang in Korean, in 2007. Now, in stark contrast to this tradition, that valued the theological potential of this passage, modern scholars have almost unanimously been dismissive of Bildad's contribution. Like the other friends, Bildad has not fared well among modern scholars, who typically denigrate the prophets of Job's friends as disingenuous comforters and shallow theologians. Job has just issued one of the most moving depictions of human suffering in the face of social injustice, presided over by God in the preceding chapter 24, 1 to 17. Yet Bildad, critics charge, offers a perfunctory response with no novel insight, only plagiarized platitudes, meaning what he says is simply uh, repeating what Eliphaz had proclaimed. Bildad was an uncreative, unoriginal thinker. Bildad completely ignores what Job has said. So his modern detractors contend, instead of engaging issues that have pained Job, says one commentator, Bildad resorts to a doxology, extolling the greatness of God in contrast to the sinfulness of humanity. So instead of engaging Job, Bildad simply turns to doxology. In the same vein, another interpreter charges that doxology is a cheap cop out by Bildad because he could not defeat Job in debate. This is a very common view, and yet there are no formal features of a doxology in this passage, save perhaps the participial phrase in verse 2b. Otherwise, the claim that this poem is a doxology derive only from the affinities of verses 4 to 5 with Psalm 8. Despite the affinities with Psalm 8, a doxology, Bildad's brief speech is not itself a doxology, but a direct response to Job, I contend. Job had imagined um, seeking a divine abode where he might present his case before God. But God is nowhere to be found. In contrast to Psalm 139, Job encounters not an omnipresent God, but omni-absent God. Before God, who is alone, sovereign, and utterly unaccountable, Job is in dread, though he remains defiant. Yet God seemed to Job remote and apathetic about the pervasiveness of injustice in the world. Unwilling to abandon his quest for justice, therefore, Job took it upon himself to rectify wrong by a series of non theistic curses. So that's how I read 24:18 to 25. As Jan Asman argued, curses often the last resort for attaining justice. When the gods don't respond, people curse. Job would thus ensure that justice is done, even if God would not be involved. Bildad now responds specifically to the issues of divine authority and dread. As is common in Semitic poetry, we may take the opening line of the poem here as a title line, the incipit, that announces the topic, Hamshel vafachat imo. Interpreters typically understand Hamshel to mean dominion or sovereignty. He feels absolute. Divine sovereignty is indeed an overarching issue in the speech. The verb mashal, to rule or govern, recurs in acclamations of God's sovereignty. Yet there is an important nuance in the hifil of mashal, the causative form, which always refers to delegated authority, authorization to govern, the empowerment to govern, as in Psalm 8. Bildad's claim is that God is the one who bestows the prerogative of governance on humankind. Given this usage of the hifil of mashal in Psalm 8, with which this speech shares a number of affinities, we may understand hamshel to mean authority. There's authority to govern, to be Bildad's retort to Job's rumination in the preceding chapter regarding the absence of divine governance in the world and Job's presumptuousness in wanting to bring about justice, even if God is not involved. So the first word itself suggests that Bildad is responding to Job. Juxtaposed with Hamshel is Pachat, dread, a term commonly used of trepidation before divine presence, hence a term for majesty and awe, as the expression dread of Yahweh, parallel splendor of Yahweh, Isaiah 2:10, 19, and 21. This term harks back to what Job says of divine presence in 23:15 to 17. I'm in dread of him. These traits are said to be with him immoral, which many scholars regard as too abrupt and out of place, and hence should be deleted. Yet, immoral with him, in verse 2, echoes Job's perception of divine sovereignty as a problem, since any hope of Job's vindication rests immoral with him. 23, verse 7. In fact, Job has complained that many such things are with him immoral. 23:14, an allusion to God's absolute sovereignty. And that is why Job has been in dread of divine presence. 23:15. He had earlier wondered about God's governance of the world, even though wisdom and power are with him immoral. 12:13. And strength and resources are immoral with him. 12:16. Job has also doubted that he could prove himself right before his dispute, because of his dispute with him, immoral. 9 verse 3. That is to say, Bildad's use of immoral with him addresses Job's persistent concern regarding divine sovereignty. Even though Job has spoken of his dread before divine presence, Bildad seems to think that Job's questioning of divine sovereignty smacks of insufficient dread of the deity. The next line makes it clear that the 3ms suffix him in imo point forward to the Oseh Shalom, the one who created Shalom in its heights. Underlying this designation, Oseh Shalom, scholars suggest is a myth of celestial conflict, perhaps a rebellion of divine beings against the supremacy of God Most High, or a cosmogonic chaos battle. We find no such reference to God as Oseh Shalom in these contexts. But these scholars argue that the line here, Oseh Shalom, means God is the one who makes peace in his high heaven, so NRSV, or God brings harmony in his heaven, so NAB, or establishes order in heaven, NIV. Importantly, however, the epithet Oseh Shalom appears in a hymnic affirmation of Yahweh as Oseh Shalom Bara, the one who creates well-being and misfortune, parallels who forms darkness and produces light, Isaiah 45:7. The contrast between Shalom, well-being, and Ra, misfortune, in Isaiah 45:7, suggests that the point is not God as a celestial peacemaker, but rather as the creator of weal and woe, darkness and light. Moreover, Bildad's claim in 2a is not that God makes peace in heaven, but not on earth, as some commentators suggest, nor even that God makes peace in heaven, but left unsaid, the impact is the impact of peacemaking on earth, as some medieval commentators argue. Rather, Oseh Shalom, the creator of Shalom, is in his heights, Bim Romav, meaning the celestial divine abode. The Hebrew term here, marom, for heights, is used whether in plural, as here, or singular, in reference to God's celestial habitation. Marom is where God renders judgment far beyond human sight, Psalm 10, verse 5. As Rashi observed, Bildad's location of the creator of well-being in God's celestial abode is a direct response to Job's complaint about his inability to locate the abode of God in order to have his case adjudicated. 23, 3 to 4. The second line reinforces uh, and clarifies the first line. That is, authority and dread are with him. The creator of well-being in his celestial abode is in his celestial abode, not with mortals, not with mortals on earth. Thus, Yefet ben Ali in the 10th century and Rashbam. That is why Job could not find the divine abode, because it is in heaven. In fact, the pairing of Pachat and Shalom, well-being, is not incidental. For Job has complained of the prosperity of the wicked who enjoy Shalom, even though they have no Pachat, dread of divine punishment. 21:9. As for Job himself, he speaks of his dread of a God who is utterly sovereign and utterly unaccountable. 23:13 to 17. Bildad therefore takes up this pair in response to Job. The couplet in verse 3 poses two rhetorical questions that presume affirmative answers. The first has to do with God's celestial forces. Hayesh Mishpah Ligdudaf. Are his troops infinite, finite? Underlying this question is the trope of the deity as a divine warrior. It's an image Job has parodied in portraying God's assault on him, supported by archers as if God were attacking a city. So 16, 13, 14. Similarly, Job caricatured God's aggression against him as a siege with his troops, Gedudaf, with his troops constructing siege rams against him and setting up their camps all around his lonely tent. 19:6 to 12. Bildad's reference to Gedudaf, his troops, echoes Job's charge of God's deployment of Gedudaf, his troops, in 19 verse 12. The rhetorical question mocks Job's trivialization of the celestial hosts. Even if Job had experienced God's troops, what he has encountered is at best a very limited manifestation of the resources at God's disposal. It is not as if the God of hosts has dedicated infinite divine power to bring suffering upon him alone, as if Job thought of himself God as God's enemy. Job, enemy one. The second rhetorical question has to do with the universal impact of his light. We should not equate his light with the sun shining on everyone, as many commentators assert. The sun is never the subject of cum. Rather, his light refers to the radiance of divine presence. It is often an allusion to theophany, which is associated with light or lightning as a divine manifestation. The idiom kum al can mean to rise over, that is to prevail over, as in 1925, or to rise against, especially in military contexts, not least in the depiction of the divine warrior. In Israel's religious imagination, the luminaries of the sky represented the celestial hosts fighting in heaven, just as the terrestrial counterparts do on earth. The mention of his light in conjunction with his troops is therefore appropriate, for his light is the theophanic presence of Yahweh of hosts, who gives light to the luminaries of heaven. Jeremiah 31:35. Bildad considers it axiomatic that the rising of his light is over everyone. Now, importantly, Job's previous speech contains a stanza regarding those who rebel against the light. Among them is the murderer who rises by light to kill the vulnerable, but also those who commit offenses stealthily, thinking that no eye can see them. 24:15. Such renegades, whether operating in broad daylight against the vulnerable or under the cover of darkness against the invulnerable, do not know the light. So Job suggested in 24:16. They do not recognize or acknowledge God, though God does not seem to care. To Job, God's apathy in the face of injustice bespeaks a disturbing abdication of divine responsibility of governance. Bildad now responds to Job's perception of the world under what Job regarded as God's apathy. The assertion that divine light rises answers Job's case of the murderer who rises by light to kill the poor and the needy, unconcerned about the visibility of the offense. Bildad insists that the divine light rises al, over, or against everyone. Perhaps he has in mind the traditional expectation that God will rise against those who oppress the poor and needy. The rising of divine light also means those who sin under the cover of darkness cannot hide the offenses, for God's light rises over or against everyone. The couplet in verse 4 is widely regarded as the fulcrum of the passage. He recalls Bildad's Eliphaz's argument made twice before that humans inevitably fall short before God. The first line is reminiscent of 4:17, where Bildad says, "How can a human be right before God?" At the same time, Bildad's wording matches Job's formulation in 9 verse 2. How can a human be right with God? In contrast to Eliphaz, who speaks of the impossibility of anyone being right before God in a moral sense, Job speaks of the impossibility of anyone being with God in a forensic sense in 9:2. For no human being can be vindicated in a legal contest immoral with him. 9 verse 2. For no human being can be with him immoral. 9 verse 3. Now Bildad uses Job's formulation, though with God harks back to with him in verse 2. The second line of the couplet in verse 4 approximates what Bildad has said in 15 verse 14 about the impossibility of one born of a woman, Yelud Isha, being morally right. Can a mortal be pure or one born of a woman be right? At the same time, the expression Yelud Isha also recalls Job's observation in 14:1 about the fragility of humankind. Humanity born of a woman is short-lived and full of trouble. Yoda seems to negotiate between these perspectives regarding what it means to be born of a woman, an epithet for humanity, since every human is born of a woman. To Eliphaz, the problem is with human beings being inevitably sinful. To Job, however, the problem is humanity's fragility, an effect of creation. Eliphaz boasted his claim by comparing humanity's inadequacy to those of celestial beings in 4:18. God's servants and his angels inevitably fall short. And in 15:15, God puts no trust in his holy ones. The heavens are not pure in his sight. Bildad now exploits Eliphaz's mention of the heavens to shift the focus to the luminaries of the heavens at night. If even the moon is not bright and the stars not pure in his sight, Bildad perceives the celestial beings as untrustworthy and contrary, 4:18, 15:15. They are impure, abominable, and perverse. But Bildad is not simply regurgitating what Eliphaz has said. He's not plagiarizing Eliphaz. Indeed, Bildad's turn to the moon and the stars is a subtle but significant shift, a significant pivot, for moon and stars are not morally deficient or morally reprehensible. Rather, these luminaries fall short in luminosity. They fall short in luminosity, not least in comparison to the divine light that rises over everyone. Verse 3b. Bildad's mention of the moon and the stars recalls the poet of Psalm 8 who marvels at the splendor of the night sky with the moon and the stars set in place by God, which prompts the psalmist to compare the glorious creation of humankind as a little less than Elohim. In fact, the couplet in verse 5 prompts the reader to reconsider verse 4. Despite the wording that matches Job's formulation in verse 2, with God, with Him in 9:3, the preposition im, as Bildad uses it now, does not indicate accompaniment with, but rather comparability, as with or like, as in 9:26, several times in Job, Psalms, and Ugaritic. In retrospect, Bildad's rhetorical question in verse 4 is not how can a human being be right with God, so Job has it in 9 verse 2, but rather how can a human be right like God? So he's tweaking Job's tweaking of Eliphaz. Similarly, the point in verse 4b is that human beings, like the stars, fall short in splendor in the eyes of God. By using Job's formulation with him, Bildad is not conceding Job's preposterous notion of a legal dispute with God, 9 verse 2, a view that Bildad considers improper for not being respectful of divine authority and dread. It becomes clear in verse 5 that Bildad is in fact arguing that human beings cannot be compared with God, for even the luminaries are not worthy of such preposterous comparison. The moon and the stars are relatively deficient, for the moon is not bright, the stars are not pure. The former does not mean that the moon does not shine, as many commentators argue. Of course, the moon does shine, but they do not do so constantly. Only in a full moon do we get, only a new moon do we get a moon shining. So the moon does shine, but inconsistently and inadequately. The verb halal, to shine, can also refer to stars shining, as in Halil ben Shahar, shining one, the son of dawn, an allusion to an astral deity in Isaiah 14:12. Rather, the moon is not bright, meaning it is inadequately or inconstantly bright. The stars, too, are not are lacking in the capacity. The stars are lacking in the capacity to illuminate. They are not pure, which is to say they are not, which is not to say they are morally impure, as Eliphaz implies, but rather they manifest light only intermittently, only in twinkling. These luminaries appear at night when they're supposed to govern Mashal, just as the sun is supposed to govern Mashal by day, according to Genesis 1. Yet these derivative sources of light that God has authorized to govern do so only in a limited way. For all these all their refracted splendor, which inspired the poet of Psalm 8 to exuberant exaltation, the moon and the stars do not compare with the divine light that rises over all. The couplet in verse 5, therefore, prompts the reader to reconsider verse 4. In Psalm 8, Bildad moves from the luminaries of the sky and the status of creatures on earth to a set of creatures on earth, whom he calls Enosh and Ben Adam. Elsewhere, this pair refers to the ephemerality of humankind as creatures. The psalmist, however, marveled that the creator of the moon and the stars would deign to pay particular attention to such ephemeral human beings, even making them a little less than Elohim, which can mean divine beings or gods. This is the view of humankind that Job has parodied in chapter 7, 17 to 18. According to the poet of Psalm 8, God has bestowed on humanity the authority to govern, Hifil of Mashal, other creatures. Consistent with this understanding, Bildad insists at the outset that the bestowal of the prerogative of governance belongs to God alone. Bildad's allusion to the high anthropology of Psalm 8 is therefore to its opposite effect. Instead of amazement at humanity's real exalted status in creation, as the exuberant psalmist has it, Bildad, having heard both Eliphaz and Job on this matter, radically tempers the high anthropology of Psalm 8, even likening human creatures to a maggot and a worm. How utterly contrary to the rhapsody of the psalmist that human beings are created a little less than Elohim. What Bildad says is not a put down of Job, for Job himself has referred to the maggot, Rima, several times in his depiction of his own condition, the human condition. To this, Bildad adds the image of the worm, Tolea, a metaphor for human lowliness and death. Elsewhere, these puny creatures, Rima and Tolea, are mentioned together only in Isaiah 14:11, in a taunt of the arrogant mortal, the king of Assyria, who dared to imagine ascending to the heights of heaven, above the stars of Ale, to the celestial divine abode, to usurp the sovereignty of God. Isaiah 14:12 to 14. Yet, according to the prophet, that impertinent mortal will end up among maggots and worms in the realm of the dead. Bildad's poem thus moves from the sovereignty and majesty of God on high, in verse 2, to the existential limitation of humanity on earth. Human beings are inevitably limited, he submits, not because they are inherently depraved or contemptible, but because they are like the puny creatures that symbolize death and decay, mortal. They are mortal. Then, as often in Job and in Hebrew poetry, the image of death signals poetic closure. This closure is pertinent, is poignant, for Job had previously ended his speech, daring anyone to call him a liar or to dismiss his speech as nothing. Bildad does not do so. Instead, he concurs with Job's own assessment regarding the lowly status of humankind, a maggot. Contrary to most commentators, Bildad's speech is not a doxology that disregards the protestations of Job. I hope I've succeeded in demonstrating that Bildad is specifically responding to Job. Indeed, virtually every line in this passage, right, responds substantially to Job. Modern interpreters have also ventured that the brevity of Bildad's speech indicates the subsiding of the orthodox position espoused by Job's friends, who have literally run out of things to say. There's some truth to this assessment, for Bildad's terse response is the last response of the friends, as if they have been effectively silenced. Job has demonstrated in his previous discourse that he's at least as concerned as his friends about sin, and he has been insistent, as insistent as they, that there must be retribution for sin. In so doing, he has undermined much of what they've had to say. For retribution has been the singular preoccupation in all their speeches, notably in the second cycle. As Christopher Sykes puts it, that ground is effectively cut out from under the French, unquote. But this is not to say that all Bildad could do now is to scramble a response that interpreters have derogated as sputtering, shallow, simplistic, unoriginal, platitudinous, and traditional. There can be no doubt that Bildad, like his companions, is steeped in tradition. Yet what he sets forth in his speech is not what some scholars call entrenched traditionalism. As John Walton puts it, Job does not rehash the views of others, as his modern detractors charge. He does not adopt Eliphaz's articulation regarding human imperfection wholesale. Rather, Bildad adapts it in his own reconsideration of the human inadequacy before God. Bildad even quotes Job's retort to Eliphaz, though he does not fully subscribe to Job's position either. Most remarkably, Bildad makes no mention whatsoever of a traditional understanding of retribution for moral failure, as if conceding to Job on this point. Nonetheless, Bildad does not abandon tradition. Instead, he forges a new theological position by drawing upon another traditional strand, the high view of humanity, as evident most notably in doxology in Psalm 8. Even so, Bildad does not regurgitate the high anthropology of the enthusiastic psalmist. It is helpful here to draw on the sociologist Edward Shields' distinction between tradition as traditum, the static material that is passed down, and tradition as traditio, the dynamic process of traditioning. Bildad does not mindlessly invoke tradition as he has received it. Rather, Bildad participates in traditio. He participates in the hermeneutical process of rethinking and reimagining tradition to find new meanings in response to challenging circumstances. Bildad appears to have taken the arguments of Job to heart, and he's admirably open to forego certain long-standing theological positions, even foregoing the long-standing and universally accepted assumption that suffering is evidence of sinfulness. Bildad was willing to let that tradition go. Still, Bildad's understanding of tradition allowed him to go only part way with Job. Particularly galling for Bildad is what he perceives to be Job's irreverent critique of divine sovereignty. Even worse, Job, who has cast himself as representative of humanity, dared to presume that he could bring about justice by his non-theistic curses of the wicked. Even if God is not involved, Job will bring about justice. To Bildad, Job had misconstrued humanity's delegated prerogative of governing the cosmos on God's behalf. Bildad subverts such a traditional theological anthropology. Modern assessments of Bildad's speech, have been unanimously dismissive, even condemnatory. One scholar, Robert File, characterized Bildad's speech as a sour tirade, without saying what is so acerbic or polemical about it. Even more harshly, David Kleins accuses Bildad of blatant dishonesty. Quote, he tells lies about God. He tells lies too about humanity. But where are the lies? Where are the lies? Another scholar regards Bildad's emphasis on transcendence as, quote, teetering on the brink of deism agnosticism. This startling and nearly universal antipathy towards this speech by Bildad far exceeds the usual censorious reactions to his other discourses and those of his companions. My question is this: why have critics been so indignant about this brief speech in particular? The chief cause of offense appears to be the final couplet, with identification of a human creature as maggots and worms. Whereas pre modern interpreters found this image of human lowliness theologically instructive, modern readers take strong offense and strong exception to it. To many, Bildad's analogies demean human beings as detestable, putrefying, and utterly worthless. Some critics gleefully point out that in his denigration of humanity, Bildad has unwittingly denigrated himself, for he too is a maggot and a worm. In this vein, Stuart Lazine contends that Bildad's perception of humanity presumes a view from above, like God's, though by Bildad's own definition of humanity, he too is but a worm and a maggot. Bildad's view of the despising sight of humanity is hardly the same as as the God's eye vision of humanity, says Lazine. Bildad has missed the irony that he has included himself in this extremely low view of humanity. Perhaps, or perhaps there's more than meets the eye. To those who are predisposed to villainize Job's friends, the metaphors of maggot and worm only add insult to injury. Theologically sensitive readers decry Bildad's maggot theology, as Longman puts it, or his worm theology, as Daniel Simonson has it. Such a view of humanity, according to these scholars, contradict the broader scriptural affirmation of human dignity. Yet the maggot is a metaphor Job himself has invoked repeatedly, most immediately in his preceding speech, 24:20. One might even take Bildad to be conceding the truth of what Job has said about human condition, thus confirming that Job is indeed not a liar, 24:25. As for the metaphor of the worm, it is God's designation for the suffering servant, Isaiah 41:14, which is hardly an insult of one in whom God delights, Isaiah 42:1. Bildad's purpose is to leave no doubt that humankind is not just a little lower than Elohim. The maggot and the worm are symbols of death. As such, they are apt metaphors for humanity, for they register the most decisive trait of humanity as being unlike God, their mortality. Human dignity and worth are beside the point. So the attack on Bildad is uncalled for. Now, admittedly, words take on different meanings to those who receive them, regardless of their authorial intention. Those who value Bildad's theological contribution might wish he had chosen metaphors that do not offend the sensibilities of readers. Yet, every human theological articulation, no matter how well wrought or profound, will ultimately prove inadequate for humans about maggots and worms. This too is a lesson of the poem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seow. And now we will invite our respondent, Dr. Elaine Goh, to respond to this paper. She's currently the acting principal of Seminary Theology Malaysia in Seremban. Dr. Elaine Goh is also an ordained minister of the Methodist Church in Malaysia, and her primary research interests include wisdom literature, cross-textual hermeneutics, and biblical interpretation. And we've been having a series of public lectures, and Dr. Elaine Goh has been a very good conversationist with Dr. Seow's scholarship on the Book of Job. So we look forward to her response.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And may I begin? Do you see my screen? I just shared the first slide responding to Dr. Seow, who is my former doctoral supervisor. So in Profound Worm Theology, Bildad as Traditional Theologian, this paper, Dr. Seow offers a sustained defense of Bildad's final speech in the Book of Job, chapter 95, against the near consensus of modern scholarship that dismisses Bildad as a shallow and theologically exhausted person, Seow argues that Bildad's brief speech is in fact a carefully constructed and theologically innovative response to Job's preceding discourse. Dr. Seow observes a reversal. Whereas pre-modern readers mine theological depth from Bildad's words, contemporary commentators largely treat the speech as superficial or lacking in originality. The brevity of Job 25 is often interpreted as signaling the collapse of French orthodoxy, and Dr. Seow challenges this verdict. Advocating that Bildad is a traditional theologian, Seow reinterprets Job 25. Among many, for example, in Job 25 verse 4, the preposition im need not mean with, as in Job 9:2, but may signal comparison. How can a human be right like God? Bildad rejects the comparability of humanity to God. Born of a woman, an epithet of humanity, and the moon and the stars in verse 5, relatively deficient in luminosity, signifying limitedness in humanity. Thus, the maggot and worm metaphors in verse 6 are further reminders of human frailty. And Bildad's worm theology is therefore not about moral contempt for humans, but ontological condition of human existence. Okay, on the notion of human as worm. Okay, Dr. Seow draws on Martin Luther's metaphors and Isaac Watts' hymn and a Korean woman's story of a worm. I find the latter most interesting because I am interested in cross-cultural and cross-textual hermeneutics. I like to dialogue with Dr. Seow by pointing attention to a Chinese novel, Spring Silkworm, Living Like Worms by Mao Dun of 1932, the first of a three-part series from his Village trilogy, which was quickly made into a film by the same name, Spring Silkworm, 春蚕. As pointed out by Dr. Seow, the worm became a metaphor for the lowliness and vulnerability of suffering humanity. Excuse me, Marsh. Okay, please mute your microphone. As pointed out by Dr. Seow, the worm became a metaphor for the loneliness and the vulnerability of suffering humanity. The silkworm acts as a metaphor for the reality of life by the peasants, villagers, who are dehumanized through their helplessness and alienated labor. The publication of Silkworm, Spring Silkworm, and the film communicated powerfully the dehumanization of the story's characters and their worm-like existence. Reduced to living as worms, humans have become the lowest common representation of life. And this concept is believed to be inspired by Lu Xun, widely considered the founder of modern Chinese literature, who depicts the marginalized or base characters in his work as worm-like 虫子, to criticize the stagnation and dehumanizing nature of traditional Chinese society. His work, Lu Xun's work, frequently depicted the masses or marginalized character as worm-like, not merely as an insult, but to portray them as trapped in a primitive, non-human state or bare-lived due to oppressive feudal traditions. People are degraded by their helpless submission, feudalism, capitalism, and imperialism. And Lu Xun's and Mao Dun's work is more of sociological rather than ontological, as in the Book of Job. In the reading of Dr. Seow, Bildad has radically lowered his portrayal of anthropology, likening the human creature to a maggot and a worm. Dr. Seow has rightly pointed out that Job himself has referred to as maggot Rima several times, depicting his own human condition, as pointed out by Dr. Seow, chapter 7, verse 5, 17, 14, 21, 26. And Bildad enhanced here further with the image of a worm tolea, a metaphor for human loneliness and imagery of death. Bildad contrasted the majesty of God in heaven, verse 2, to the existential lowliness of human on earth, verse 6, just as Mao Dun's work in juxtaposing the richness of the feudal lords and the capitalists in contrast to the poverty and lowliness of peasants in his work, in his worm-like analogy. The contrast is intended in Mouton's novel, so as in Bildad's rhetoric, as Dr. Seow has pointed out, to respond substantially to the suffering Job. Bildad did not disregard Job's protest. He actually echoed Job that humans are like worms. And similarly, Mouton's silkworm villagers are humans who are excluded from themselves as human. They are bare lives, neither human nor animal. Quote from the book. The worm metaphors from both literary work of Bildad and of spring silkworm convey powerfully the miserable state and deprived condition of a human sufferer. Understanding the worm-like analogy of Bildad in Job 25 verse 6 will enable a cross-cultural reader and a cross-cultural interpreter like me to appreciate more of Job's poetry. In this regard, Bildad's poetry. In this worm-like analogy in 25 verse 6, the last verse among Job's friends, Bildad's brevity in his response to Job is beautiful and appropriate closure to all the speeches by Job's three friends. If human is as low and tiny as worm, what is left to say more? And if the maggot and worm are symbols of death, as Dr. Seow has maintained, what is left for human to say but to face their own mortality in silence? Therefore, Bildad ceased talking, so as Zophar, who does not speak for the third time. No more dialogues of the fourth cycle. No more fourth cycle. I like to raise one question nonetheless. Worm imagery evokes degradation. Even if Bildad includes himself within this anthropology, the question persists. Does this ontological leveling risk downplaying injustice from Job 24, the chapter before 25? Simply put, if all are worms before God, does that flatten the irregularity between victim and oppressor that Job so forcefully articulates? My conclusion, Dr. Seow's reading of Psalm 8 in conversation with Job 25 is compelling. The theology of Psalm 8 does not merely celebrate delegated rule, it marvels that the transcendent God remembers and cares for humanity. Job's protest presumes precisely this relational expectation. Job does not deny divine transcendence. He questioned divine attentiveness. Here in Bildad's speech, humanity is further likened to a worm and maggot. Will God even pay attention to a worm-like human like Job? Echoing Job's protest, will God even pay attention to me? In chapter 7, verse 5. My last slide. Dr. Seow's paper challenges the misinterpretation of Bildad as a theological lightweight. Actually, he's a theological heavyweight. It restores to Job 25 rhetorical logic, intertextual connection, and the theological depth. So Dr. Seow's paper invites broader theological conversation to reckon more with the complexity of the dialogue in Job. And Job's friends are not empty opponents, which I agree. They are theological conversation partners. As Job does, on the subject of the mystery of God. Theological conversations and understandings, when dynamically reinterpreted, remains a living dialogue even until today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elaine. I've put an announcement in the chat box. And so now we will move on to the New Testament section. And I would like to introduce our New Testament presenter, Dr. Tsang. He is, I believe, currently in the US, but Dr. Tsang is no stranger to us. He is a distinguished professor, a visiting professor at STM on a yearly basis, and he will be coming in June. And Dr. Sam is a prolific writer, and he has published more than 50 books on biblical studies. So today we're excited to hear from him. And his favorite topic is Seeing John's Vision, Living Ethically, an ekphrastic suggestion for reading Revelation. So all over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the Old Testament presentation. that has answered many of my questions since I was doing my MDiv on Job and the worm theology. So that was very delightful and gave me some new insights methodologically as well as exegetically on a very important way of reading Job. Thank you again. So today, I'm not going to read my paper because I do not read my paper very well, like Professor Seow would. So I will explain parts of my paper, and I think people who would be interested can just purchase the published volume when it comes out. So what I will do is I will go through the important parts of my paper and explain them, because I think at an audience like this, there will be various degree of exposure to revelation and the terminologies. So I think it would be good for me to explain some of these ideas and where I got them from and the method by which I read Revelation. So today what I will do is I will first talk about definitions and also justify why we would use a particular method in reading Revelation. Why would we use an ekphrastic way of reading? So I would explain what ekphrastic actually means. And then we would talk about presuppositions. What are some of the baseline presuppositions I would use to read Revelation for this paper? You may not share the same presuppositions. That's okay. I just need to at least give a baseline presupposition of what I would use to read Revelation. And then finally, I will use the rest of my time to demonstrate how to do something like this. And this part is not in my paper. And I feel like it is important rather than just staying within discussions on theories to actually demonstrate what that theory looks like when I practice it. I think Professor Seow has demonstrated perfectly how he reads. So I want to also demonstrate how I would do it because my paper that I wrote is mostly theoretical rather than praxis. So what I will do is I would go through a particular text. We're looking at Revelation chapter 17 at the beginning where it described the woman on the beast. And then I would use my method in looking at how we can look at a text like this. And I would also use a particular panel that I had taken pictures of when I was in Rome, called the Arapaches, which is the peace altar of Augustus, which is an important piece of artifact, or you can't even call it an artifact. It's more like an artifice. It's a huge bunch of panels, and it's almost like a building. It's being housed in a building in Rome right now. So I will use a panel from that and help us walk through the panel, one particular panel, and looking at how an image of a woman is presented in the Greco-Roman world and how that portrays Roman value in comparison to what is being said in Revelation 17 and 18, and why in an understanding of what woman actually means in those days and what a prostitute and so on and so forth would help us to understand the message of Revelation. So this will be my agenda today. So as a way of introduction, why I would think about writing a paper like this, I felt almost a little prescient because when I wrote the paper, the US had not declared war on Iran. And, recently, something about Revelation really popped up in the news. Pete Hegseth, who is the Defense Department head, or now we call it the War Department, department head, had said before the troops that to encourage them to fight this war because supposedly it would bring forth Armageddon and the coming of Jesus Christ. He said this in public in front of all his military men. That's certainly one way of reading Revelation. And what I'm trying to say in this paper is, if we read Revelation a particular way, it would result in a particular type of ethical praxis. Therefore, it is important for us to understand what are some of the possible ways that we can read Revelation, especially in the context of first century. So let me start by definition. So whenever I look for a definition, I always want to see what the popular definition is coming out of, let's say, Wikipedia. Ekphrasis. What does ekphrasis mean? Wikipedia had split up the word and made it the roots of ek and phrasis, in ek being out and phrasis being speaking out about something. Now, the root of any Greek word is only limited, is so limited, right? Because as all of us who have studied Greek, we know that using roots to interpret the Greek word is very, very dangerous. So rather than using that definition, which I think is inadequate at best and probably misleading at most, I would want to draw from two sources, two ancient sources, in how they define ekphrasis or ekphrasis. The first source I would want to draw from is Plato's Phaedrus. Plato's Phaedrus was written around 370 BCE. It is a rhetorical work in talking about how the people in the Greek time, in the time of Plato, how they would perform rhetoric, how they would compose rhetorical pieces, mostly for defending somebody in court or giving public speeches. So how is ekphrasis being described or defined in Plato's work in Phaedrus? It's very simple. It's just to describe an object, to describe an object. And of course, we can extend that definition to describing people or an event. So let's say I'm describing a parade, I would talk about in many ways and select my words on what words I would use to describe this parade so that my readers would understand what had actually happened in the parade, right? So Plato gives us a definition of describing an object. Another piece of literature that's a collected work of rhetoric, rhetorical instructions from 1st century to 5th century CE or AD is Progymnasmata. Progymnasmata. Progymnasmata, what is progymnasmata? Gymnasmata is where we get our word gymnasium or gym from. Many of us go to the gym to do our exercise. So progymnasmata means actually for exercise, gymnasmata being exercise. So what does that mean to be for exercise, this word, this title for this book? It actually means an exercise on rhetoric. So it would talk about various types of exercises to help you to perform better rhetoric. And under ekphrasis, this is what the definition is for ekphrasis. It says to bring what is portrayed before the sight. To bring what is portrayed before the sight. Now, this stuff is all sort of in my book and in my article and so on, so you can just look at it there if you want. But more importantly, all of this has to do with the way somebody writes. Now, why would I use something like this to view Revelation? So this brings me to my justification or discussion as to why I would use a particular theory to read Revelation. If you read the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation is full of vocabulary on viewing. So there are three major words being used to discuss what viewing is. One word is blepo, the other one is idu, and the other one is orao. So these are the three major Greek words that occur throughout the book of Revelation. So if you read some of us are not seminary students and we didn't take Greek and so on. So some of us would say, well, what does that mean? If you look at Revelation, you see a lot of behold and then I saw something. These kinds of things are throughout Revelation, right? So Revelation itself is presented as a vision. So if you think about the book being presented in the form of a vision, the ekphrastic reading would really make sense. Because if ekphrastic reading is, or composition is meant to describe something so that the audience can see through the words being read, quite often back in John's day, the book was not read by somebody, rather it was listened to by an audience. So when the audience hears the book being presented, they would hear and see at the same time. Right? So as they're hearing, they are using images as they're hearing to connect to their hearing, to make sense of what is going on as the book is being presented. So what I suggest is a method of visual exegesis. Now, this visual exegesis is not meant to supplant or usurp the place of our grammatical exegesis, which Dr. Seow has done extensively for Job. Rather, it's there to complement, in fact, to synthesize what we put in words. And when we put them together into an image, what image are the words painting, right? So if you look at Revelation sort of as a moving, like a movie, tonight is actually Oscar night, where the best picture supposedly would get awards and so on. I'm not watching it. I'm here with you guys. So I don't want to watch it anyway, so I'm happy to be here. We're used to seeing a movie, but when we read the Bible, we sort of put that aside. But if we imagine Revelation to be a writing that's performing like a movie, then it would make sense. So the words aren't just words, they are meant to be put together so they can together present a moving picture of something that's going on. So how would I approach something like ekphrastic reading? Just for tonight's purpose, I would approach it in 3 different steps. The first step I would take would be to narrow down the pericope of the narrative. That means I want to find out where this particular scene starts and where it finishes. So Revelation is telling a series of stories. They're moving, like pictures, like movies. And we're looking at scene to scene to scene. And because scenes are meant to be seen, not merely heard, so we have to narrow down where the scene is, right? So if we're looking at a picture, we have to look at what this picture is, how it fits into everything else. So it's important to narrow down what the pericope of the narrative. What are we studying? From what verse to what verse? So that's to get the full picture of this scene, of this story being told. And the second step I would take is to check in with the Greco-Roman world, especially the Roman world, in its symbolic universe. Let me explain what that actually means, what symbolic universe is. In every single culture, there is a symbolic universe. And the symbolic universe is merely a collection of images that have meaning for that culture. For example, if you come to America, we would see a stop sign. I don't know if the stop sign is the same way in Malaysia. I don't remember. Although I've been to Malaysia many times, I still don't remember how your stop sign looks like. Usually I'm just sitting in the passenger side. But if you look at the stop sign just as its own shape, you can tell it is a stop sign. So that shape is not just a shape. When you look at the shape, you think of the stop sign. Now, perhaps in a different culture, the same shape could mean something else. But in America, when we look at that shape, we would also allude to the stop sign. So if I draw that shape of a stop sign, you would think about the stop sign instead of say, oh, that's just a shape. So every culture has many different ways of looking at things, and everything they look at would mean differently, even though they're looking at the same thing. So the symbolic universe is a collection of these images. And when I start demonstrating what I'm doing, what I'm trying to say today, through that panel, then you would see clearly what the symbolic universe I'm referring to in the Roman world in regards to women and women's role. And the third step I would take is to fit back 1 and 2 into the greater narrative of the book. Now, I may or may not have time tonight to do that. I don't want to run over time. So I may cut, I may just simply allude to it at the end, right? But the third part is important because Revelation is a series of narratives or scenes that are presented by the author for the audience to hear and to see in their mind's eyes through the symbolic universe of the Romans. But these scenes are collectively creating a story, right? So you have stories, and then it's one big story that leads from one scene to next scene to next scene all the way to the end. So it's important to take the step number 3 to put that back into the overall picture of Revelation. So now I'm going to go towards my presupposition very quickly. When I'm reading Revelation, what do I presuppose? First thing I presuppose is it's probably written around post 90 AD or post 90 CE. That's fairly common among many of the scholars of Revelation. So that's around the reign of Domitian. So we would presuppose that. And also, the second presupposition I have is that Revelation, the church is under some sort of duress or persecution. But let me clarify what that means. The church's persecution is not consistent or throughout. If we read a lot of the Roman literature about how they dealt with Christians or Christ followers, whether the officials, they don't really know how to persecute them because they don't look different, or they look like everybody else, right? So persecution is notoriously hard to execute, even if it's a imperial edict. So many people would agree that Domitian had wanted Christians persecuted, but whether that can be executed everywhere, we do not know. But Christians being under duress can take on many different forms other than being put to death or put in prison. And it could be other ways that they can go under duress. They can not participate in certain rites and be alienated and so on and so forth. So those things are all included as a spectrum of hardship that Christians could experience. So some may not experience also. And this proves to be very true as well in places that are persecuted, like China, for example. China, even in its most severe persecution, is not always consistent in every way. And every country that's got persecution has got the same situation. So that's the second presupposition. The third presupposition is quite simple. It's almost readily obvious, but a lot of people reading Revelation do not take it seriously. So I would just go to chapter 1, verse 4, and using John's words and how what he said is intended. 1:4 basically said John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia, and then the rest of Revelations being written. Now, understand, a lot of people read chapter 1, verse 4 as a discussion on or an introduction of only chapters 2 and 3, and that's a big mistake. Because 1:4 is talking about the entire book. So if you think about it, the entire book of Revelation is meant for the 7 churches in Asia. That means to a large degree, the 7 churches in Asia, they did understand what Revelation was about for them. This is an important presupposition to undergird my reading methodology. Now, quite often people would say, well, Christians in the present day, they can read Revelation much better than the original readers. You've heard this in popular church gathering sermons and so on and so forth. I beg to differ. I think if we take John's words seriously in chapter 1, verse 4, we have to say that Revelation was meant for its original audience to understand. We only think we understand because we are reading paper and we're misreading the text. And we think they don't understand, but we do not even understand what they understood, right? So tonight I want to demonstrate something to you that even something as simple as this woman, what does that all mean? It's very different from what we imagine today, what that actually meant. So if you apply that to everything in Revelation, all of a sudden Revelation becomes a very foreign book to us. You know, a lot of people now say, oh, we now know how to interpret Revelation. This means that, this means that, this means this country, this means that country. That country means US, you know. US was not even born yet. So that clearly was not within John's purpose to writing chapter 1, verse 4. Now, let me demonstrate in reading now from chapter 17, verses 1 to 5 in my remaining time with you guys in presenting this. Chapter 17, verses 1 to 5. Let's just see what the text actually said when describing this woman, right? So I'm not going to read my NIV, and you know I would refer to it. I think if you don't read the Greek text, just pull out your NIV. I'm just going to point out a few words, just simple words. The first description of this person is a woman, gune, simple Greek word, woman, right? Just describing her in terms of her gender. Second word describing this woman is prostitute, porne. Okay, it's prostitute, porne. Porne is where we get our word pornography from. Usually that's description of a person who practices prostitution. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and how that's different, perhaps from today. Well, there's some similarities, obviously. They're sex workers, but it goes a little bit beyond that. But I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to try to do next, right? What I just stated for you is what the text says. Now, because we're looking at how the author describes the scene, I would say we also have to look at what the text describes. Not just what the text says, but actually what the text describes in the entirety of the story, right? So when I'm reading commentaries, I have seen some intriguing, interesting, even novel suggestion as to what scene this text is describing. You know, perhaps I should read the English Bible just to get clarity, because you know I don't think you guys are reading the English Bible or Greek Bible as I'm talking. You can't read and talk, listen to me talk at the same time. It's going to be very confusing. So let me just briefly read it, and you see what I'm saying. So starting at verse 1, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. This title was written on her forehead: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth." Okay, so you get the whole picture of what's being written here. So the author is spending time to describe what's going on in verses 1 to 5. And there has been a suggestion that this is a description of the Roman courtesan. The Roman courtesan. The Greek word for courtesan is hetaira. Hetaira. The problem of that suggestion is that nowhere did John say she was a courtesan. So we are actually looking at the scene in tension as to what's going on here with this woman. And so I'm going to later discuss the difference between the two, the porne and the hetaira, so that we can get a fuller picture of why scholars think of this as a courtesan, and even such a novel suggestion does it have a place in our interpretation, right? So now we're going to look at first what the text says when we compare with a panel I want to show you. So I'm going to share this panel with you of the Arapashas. The Arapashas is an altar made upon the death of Augustus. If you go to Rome, I hope you can have a chance to go see the Arapashas. The Arapashas itself is a masterful piece of imperial propaganda. In fact, it is housed in a museum by itself. This is a really beautiful piece. It depicts not just the Roman royal family, but the entire Arapashas is the size of a small building. The panels themselves can go as high as almost 2 stories. So when I visited Rome, I made myself, spend considerable time there looking at these things, taking pictures, studying, and so on, because I'm interested in Greco-Roman culture as a background for biblical studies and reading of the New Testament and so on. This is only a very small part of a piece of panel. The panels are huge and big and very, very. You can spend half a day there. You would not be spending too much time. Things would depict. These panels would depict the founding of Rome, the mythologies, all the way to the time of Augustus, and all the important people. They should appear on these panels. Now, let me explain to you what's going on overall in this panel and make some observations about this panel before I go into the various characters in this panel. So you can see that this is what the original readers of John would see in the public buildings, not just this panel, obviously, not all of them live in Rome, but public buildings are full of things like this. So this is within the symbolic universe. This is within the visual world. So when they hear about revelation about women and so on, and dressing in this kind of garb and that kind of garb, they already have an image in their heads as to what John is saying versus what we do not, because we look at this thing and say, oh, that's very nice. People look very nice in here. That's it. That's all we get out of this. But it is so much more. So if you look at this panel with me, you will notice in the panel, there are some important women. I will describe them later. And this is a processional scene. Let me explain what processional scene is. This processional scene in particular is a sacrificial scene. So these people are walking towards a religious ceremony, right? This is actually part of the royal family. They're walking towards a religious ceremony. In other parts of the same panel, you will see the priest and so on. Experts told us that when we look at the entire panel, we find that the Pontifex Maximus, which is the head priest of Augustus' time, missing in this panel. That's interesting. What is in a panel versus what is not in the panel is also interesting, right? Because you have to understand the history of the time. And we would wonder, why is that important person not there? Quite obviously, because he and Augustus had kind of a fallout. So they decided to write him off the panel when they're honoring Augustus and so on. So there are subtleties like this that would help you appreciate the ideology behind the formation of this panel. They have to figure out how to frame it visually to make that message very clear, right? So if you look at this panel, I want you to notice the two women. They're very important characters. They almost play a central role in this panel. And also the men with the two women, and also obviously the children. And we notice one woman is looking at her mate, or maybe she's looking at the other woman. So this panel tells something. It tells a story. It's not just artwork. So let me attempt to tell the story behind this panel. So when you look at this panel as the original audience would look at, you would see the message. So let's start from the left to the right. The left is Antonia the Younger, or Antonia Minor. She's the one looking back at her mate. I would explain who her mate is very soon. Antonia the Younger is the younger daughter of Octavia the Younger. Now, Octavia the Younger, or Octavia Minor, is Augustus' sister. So now you can see that she is a very important part of the royal family. Now, I want you to look at her mate, the man she's looking at, or she could be looking at the other woman, but let's just say the man that's behind her. The man behind her is Drusus. Drusus is in military garb. His way of dressing shows that he's a military man. She's Antonia's husband. And she is Livia, younger son. Livia is Augustus' wife. Now, this makes Drusus the stepson of Augustus. Now, why is this important? Well, Augustus married Livia in her second marriage. It's a long story. Livia was pregnant with a baby, most likely the one that she made with Augustus, and Augustus had used coercion and force to force her husband to divorce her so she can be married to Augustus. Then she became the empress. And then the son turned out to be Drusus. So Augustus basically had a stepson, more of an adopted son, pretty much. So this person's important. Now, if we look at the baby, that's a very cute baby holding hand with the mom. I see that on the left side, right? The little baby. The baby is Germanicus. Germanicus is an extremely important character in Roman history. She's obviously Antonia Minor's son. Germanicus is arguably the greatest general in the Julian dynasty. Julian dynasty starting at Augustus all the way to ending at Nero. He was a very capable general. He had the heart of the troops. He had respect of society. When he died, it was a terrible time of mourning. He died actually early in the campaign in an area where we now consider Germany. It was one legend had that he was poisoned. Another story said that he got sick and died in this campaign. Regardless, he would be a very important person in Augustus' family. If you think about this baby, his role originally with all the glory that he was bringing to the Roman Empire, he was possibly going to succeed Augustus when Augustus died. So his presence here, although he is a cute baby at this point, is very important because it actually gives the hope and dreams of the Roman Empire. Because if Augustus had no successor, the empire can fall into a great disarray or even possibly civil war, right? So having this baby here assures the person looking at it that there's great hope in the empire because there's going to be a successor. And the successor obviously came from good pedigree, and Antonia Minor is from good pedigree. Now, let me pause here to look at the woman's role here. Her role is to do what? Her role is very much defined by her usefulness for the empire, and also her relationship with her husband, who is an important royalty, whose son will succeed, possibly the great Emperor Augustus. So in this way, the woman's role that she plays is defined by, number one, her usefulness to the society. Second of all, by her whom she marries, which indicates her usefulness. And the way that she dresses indicates her role as well. If you look at her dress, it's a wrapped dress. If you look at Roman women's dressing, look at both of the women. The drapery is wrapped around them. Now, these days, fashion has progressed towards other ways, right? Fashion now uses different patterns and so on. But back in those days, fashion is very simple. So how can you distinguish a person from a noble family or noble class, wealthy class versus a person who is not? It's by the way they fold their clothes. So look at all the folds in her clothes. Based on what we have studied on ancient fashion, it takes maid servants sometime in the morning to help them fold their clothes and dress in a certain way. So having these folds, having this kind of texture in their clothing is an indication of her high class, wealthy status. So even something like that is very symbolic. When you look at it, you say, oh, that's nice, right? That's how they dress. No, if you dress by yourself, you can't do what she does with those clothes, with what she's got. So women are defined by also, they express themselves by the pleats in their clothing. Now, this becomes important when we start reading Revelation 17. Because when we read Revelation 17, we have this woman who's also dressed in a certain clothing, right? So that's important to look at when we contrast Revelation 17 versus what we see in this panel. Now behind her, that's another woman. That's her sister, actually, is Antonia Major, Antonia the Elder, who's got her husband behind her as well, who is dressed up in this sort of ceremonial clothing. You notice he's also got lots of pleating on his clothes because somebody else helped him dress, because he can afford slaves and people to help him dress. So that's also another way of showing his class. His name is actually Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. So he was a consul of the Roman Empire. Just to give an idea what a council is, a council is like a president in a modern day. So you have the emperor and you got the council. The council is ruler over, he's basically the executive branch of the entire Roman Empire. He would be in charge of the military. He would be very much in charge, involved in the politics and so on. So he's a very important person. So you notice the woman's definition there is also defined by her mate right behind her, right? So now, having said all this, let's look back in the Revelation, because what we want to do is now, we're going to talk about, I'll just show you what we have seen here and look at what Revelation has said. And then now we're going to look at what Revelation describes, right, in the text. It's described in two different ways. One way, obviously, she's a woman. As I said earlier, the woman's defined by her social class. She is related to her husband and a child. She's also, her value is by her fertility. Now she's got a child, that's for her fertility. In fact, Livia, Augustus' wife, is often associated with fertility goddesses like Demeter, Ceres, and so on and so forth. So fertility is important because succession of the emperor is important. Now, if we look at the social construct of what's being described in 17:1-5, you can see why commentator would think that this person is a hetaira, rather than a porne, because the description here fits more of the courtesan. Courtesan is a person that's, we don't want to call them high-class prostitutes. What they are is they're mistresses of a nobleman, oftentimes. So they would be connected to noblemen in social and sexual ways. And they would draw lots of monetary favor. And many courtesans wielded enormous amount of power, right? They're not just sex workers. They exercise a lot of power, influence over their partners. Now, what is being described here with this woman is more like a courtesan rather than a common noble woman. Because if you look at the noble women, they dress actually very simple. And the Romans, they value this kind of simple dressing, what we consider, what's it called, quiet luxury. I think that's the word we use these days. It's not really loud, but it shows the kind of wealth the person has. So it's more simple dressing using pleats and folds rather than the coloring and so on. But we notice this woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, completely glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls and so on. So what we have here is more of a description of almost a courtesan. What is even more interesting, because it's more of a description of upside down world, she's dressed in purple and scarlet. Now, let me explain what purple and scarlet really is. Well, we all know what the color of purple and scarlet is, but this what is symbolic meaning of something like that, right? In those days, noble women would have purple stripes on their clothing, but only stripes. Noblemen would do the same, but only the emperor and really high officials would wear purple, like clothed in purple. So she shouldn't be clothed in purple in reality. So this is more of a fictional description that does not exist, but everyone knows is mocking the Roman Empire, or even the emperor himself who dresses in purple, who dress in purple. So what the Roman Empire has claimed its greatness to the author's description of what is happening here is at best a courtesan. But what the author says about this description is that she is a porne. Now let's go back to what a porne is. A porne is a prostitute, a low-born slave woman. That's pretty much the lowest part of society. Usually she is not dressed in a lot of clothes. If you want to refer to Pompeii, for example, the city of Pompeii has lots of these kinds of artwork where you see a lot of naked women in these artwork. If they're not in compromising position, having sexual relations, if they're naked, they're more likely prostitutes, right? So she's not going to be well dressed in purple and so on. This is a complete contrast against what a real porne looks like. So, you know, as much as the claim of Roman Empire claims that it is the greatest, it would last eternally, the eternal Rome, it is at best looks like a courtesan, but in its essence is a lowly prostitute. That's the message John is sending just by describing this way. So the image of this, what we saw today, is important. What we read is important. Because when we have other images to compare with, we can now have a clearer picture of what that all means. It is far more subversive of an image or a scene that's being described here than most people would assign for this scene to be. Now, let me conclude very quickly, because I don't want to run over time too much, is we want to put this picture back into the greater picture of Revelation, we have to look at other women in Revelation. We want to look at one particular woman, is how the church is being described dressed like a bride ready for the groom. For example, 21:2. Think about that woman in contrast to this woman. I think this particular narrative is meant to fit in the greater narrative that climaxes in having the other woman being highlighted in chapter 21, 2, and so on. So what we have here is the empty promise of Rome. John wrote this at the height of the imperial development, right? It's not at the fall of Rome. It's writing in the peak of imperial development. So what seems right and great and wealthy to the world is but a temporary illusion that will pass. That's what John is saying. I think living in our world today, ethically, lots of things don't seem right, and all the wrong people seem to be getting everything they wanted, right? But I think the message of Revelation, especially with this woman, shows to us that these things will pass, and it does give a message of hope and an ethical message of hope for modern readers as well as for ancient readers. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tsang. And now we would like to invite our respondent, who is Professor K.K. Yo, Kyok King Yo, but often known as, more commonly known as KK. So KK is not here with us right now, but he has sent a video response. Let me introduce him very, very briefly. So Professor Yo is Emeritus Professor of New Testament at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in the US, and his work focuses a lot on culture and the Bible. So Jason will share his video response with us.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you, Dr. Goh, for the invitation to engage this provocative paper, Seeing John's Vision, Living Ethically, by my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Tsang, who has previously worked and published on the apocalypse for years. My review of his essay is not a critique, I must stress, but a conversation with his work with some implications for biblical studies. Dr. Tsang's proposal to read the Apocalypse through Greco-Roman ekphrasis, vivid visual description, is bold and refreshing. It invites us, however, to consider three pressing questions. Number one, how does this visual method measure up against my heuristic fourfold model of biblical reading? Translations, expressions, interpretations, and reception. Number two, does Greco-Roman ekphrasis over-prioritize secular rhetoric at the expense of the Apocalypse Old Testament roots? And why I think a both-and reading is intrinsic for the book of Apocalypse. Number three, what are the strengths of the approach used by this paper and its telling limits that could easily be transcended? Let's dive in. Late in my career, I have developed misgivings, serious misgivings actually, about biblical studies specialization, which drives scholarship into ivory towers, mainly because of the limited self-critical awareness of its own historical presuppositions coupled with analytical dissection that quickly reduces sacred text to lifelessness. That haunted me because I have misled my students for years. Therefore, in the Oxford Handbook of the Bible in China, I propose a fourfold method to better account for meaning in the biblical text. Metaphorical translations is not is more leads to cultural expressions, then cross-cultural interpretation, and finally, community and institutional receptions of the biblical text. This fourfold reading is not linear but dynamic, as I demonstrate in the handbook. Here, the paper's ekphrasis shines, I think, at stage 2, cultural expressions. It invites us to see John's visions as ancient audiences did, especially those Greco-Roman readers, through rhetorical vividness. Picture, for example, the Son of Man in the Apocalypse chapter 1, not dissected into symbols, but scanned up and down like a grand figure overwhelming the viewers. That's compelling theater, and I love it. But here it falters because the use of ekphrasis assumes a monocultural first century audience who live as a double life of theology and ethics. Ekphrasis remains piecemeal within the Apocalypse scroll, though said in Codex, therefore betrays the whole vision of the Apocalypse, as symbolized theologically by the sevens cycles of vision that are Jewish and Greco-Roman, cross-cultural. My fourfold model would also expect Bible readers to track visuality's full arc, how it shapes ethics across cultures and embeds in communities and institutions then and now. I'm afraid that this paper gestures at living ethically but doesn't quite deliver. Where is the evidence, for example, of first century's early believers' ritual? Or later on, the Byzantine icons, or more modern audiences, the Chinese Christian art, or modern worship practices born from this vision, especially here in Malaysia, since this conference is held here. It's a pity that this visual exegesis stalls as aesthetic spectacle, detached from communal life. In my model, it is expressions without intentional reception, a pretty picture that never builds a bridge to praxis or ritualized living. So we are left seeing but not transformed. Pause with the paper's Greco-Roman foundation. It surveys Aelius, Theon, Quintilian, even Aristotle, claiming first century readers absorb the Apocalypse through ekphrasis. Vividness as rhetoric, undeniable in Greco-Roman life, though, from Homer's shield to Augustus' breastplate. Yet does John of Patmos channel this in his vision? Did he pore over primarily Rhetorica amid exile? Could Dr. Tsang's historical reading be a guise for what is actually a contemporary scholar's receptions of the Apocalypse using parallel or secondary historical texts rather than primary texts that genuinely intersect with its historical origin? Friends, the Apocalypse poses with over 800 Old Testament allusions across its 404 verses. The primary text for the Apocalypse is the Hebrew Bible. Consider this explicit visual echoes: Ezekiel's fiery wheels and living creatures, Daniel's 4 beasts arising from the sea, Zechariah's red, black, white, and devil horses, Isaiah's new heavens and new earth, and Moses, Isaiah, Daniel's seal scroll. This is intra-biblical dialogue. How much of it is Aristotelian mimesis? The Apocalypse seeing vocabulary, blepo, idu, horao, drives prophetic unveiling, less, if any at all, Homeric or Aristotelian persuasions. And the seals in chapter 6, not sequential end times, but simultaneous revelations, peel back like a scroll of the Hebrew Bible. Prioritizing Ekphrastic risks colonizing a Jewish apocalypse with pagan tools. Can we assume John read Plato, Philo, Aristotle, and Quintilian only? The paper doesn't prove it, but history whispers no. What holds up the paper's genius is its macroscopic gaze. Tired of verse by verse dissections of futurist timelines, I resonate with Dr. Tsang here. Ekphrasis zooms out, visions as holistic scenes, inviting participatory seeing. So chapter 1 of the Apocalypse, a scanning of Christ from midriff to feet to face, mimics eyes movement, pulling us in. It cites steps, dogmatism, honors, integrity, and revives visuality of the scroll neglected since Adela Yarborough Collins. Yet limits loom large. Is the Apocalypse scholarship? In the Apocalypse scholarship, I would strongly recommend two authorities the paper omits. One is David Arney's Absent is Telling. David's 3-volume commentary is the gold standard for rhetorical analysis, and he's using cross-cultural sources. He explicitly identifies, for example, Revelation 17 as Ekphrasis description of the Dia Roma coin, and discusses the Greco-Roman visual conventions engaging with the Jewish world. And then the second source by Richard Baucham's, it's also The Absence is Critical. Baucham's climax of prophecy and theology of the book of Revelation masterfully trace the apocalypse intra-biblical Old Testament allusions, the methodological counterpoint to Greco-Roman emphasis. Friends, don't discard Ekphrasis, supplement it, blend intercultural and cosmic arc with biblical intertextuality. Let visuality express culturally, rooted in Scripture's continuum, and Paul recalls notions of sacred text. Train how John's eyes becomes ours. Seeing empires fall, we resist. Beholding the Lamb, we worship. That's the Apocalypse's theological ethics of full senses engaging of our beings to wholeness. Not mere sight, but sighted, faithful obedience. Not mere sound, but harmony of differences in an eschatological redeemed community. Not mere color, but rainbow splash glory of God through our praises connecting heavens and earth. The liturgical imperative dissolves into the hortative presence in the word hallelujah. Thank you for your presence, and especially for Dr. Goh and Dr. Tsang's. Thank you for this feast. Thank you.
So we thank Professor K.K. Yeo We'll move on to some closing thoughts from our speakers as well as to Q&A. So before I pass the time back to Dr. Tsang, let me read for the purposes of those who are listening to the recording. Let me read the question related to for the NT section. So from Reverend Marvin Wong, thank you, Dr. Sam. My question is how does an ekphrasis reading add to our reading of Revelation in light of its apocalyptic genre, which has vivid imagery built into its writing? We tend to only see what we know or are familiar with. Would an ekphrasis reading prioritize Greco-Roman familiar visual symbolic world at the expense of, arguably, the Old Testament roots of these visions?
I think that's a comment and a right good critique by Professor KK, with whom I've known for years, and I appreciate his comments always. Part of why I didn't put any of that in, because we just have limited time and limited space. I've actually put that in my Chinese work under the section of intertextuality. So that part is not missing in my interpretive process. The only reason why I focus on the Greco-Roman is because it's not as commonly discussed among many people who study words, or a lot of people that don't really study the artifacts and what they mean in the Greco-Roman world. And that's the audience's world. And that's why I focus more on the Greco-Roman. It's not because I think there's no need to understand the Old Testament intertextuality. I just want to make that very clear. I didn't want to put that in my paper, otherwise my paper would just become my commentary. So I did that in my commentary. I'm recently published, and also to the point of Professor KK, with Arne and Balcom, for sure, for sure. I think those are very important authors who had been cited in my commentary. So I didn't want to add the footnote to the length of footnote, in my article. But certainly I am aware of those, and I'm very aware of the intertextuality. As to his point about whether John had read Plato, Aristotle, any of these other rhetorical handbooks, I do not believe he needs to read that. My point in defining ekphrasis and that being part of Greco-Roman culture, very deeply ingrained, starting at Plato, 380 BCE, is to show that it's been a long-running cultural phenomenon, so much so John did not need to read it. It's just part of the culture. So I'm not saying John needs to read it and borrow that technique to write, but that particular way of writing or that particular way of reading is already deeply ingrained for 300 some odd years, 400 years. By the time John had written, there's no doubt that this is just already part of the culture, that they don't need to read a rhetorical handbook to see, hey, this is how we read. That's just how they read, right? Different cultures read differently. I did see a question about what books to buy on a limited budget. I'm not going to tout my own book, of course. If you want to buy a Chinese one, you can read mine. Or you can read it in a library, On English work, I do agree that Balcom's work is really great. I'll just write it on chat. Balcom's work is great, especially his introduction on prophecy in Revelation. It's actually been translated into Chinese. So some of you guys are Chinese readers. You can feel free to read that one. It's published by Logos, Jidao in Hong Kong. That's a great introduction, just to get a full picture overall and some of the stuff that KK was talking about. And also some of the other elements that KK talked about. I do appreciate his 4-step process. I have tried to include those processes in my commentary, not so much in here. And I hesitate to deal with Malaysia context and so on because I'm not Malaysian. I don't feel comfortable dealing with a culture that I'm not an expert on. So that's partly my fault, of course, even though I come to Malaysia so often. I just don't want to be that bold and step into that space. That's part of why I would own that part and not talk about the cultural context for Malaysia and so on, even for the Chinese church. That's it.
Thank you. Sorry,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Sam. I think you probably typed the title of the book privately to the person who asked you the
Oh, did
question.
I?
Yeah, would you mind
Oh,
sending
gosh.
it to everybody?
Sure, of course.
Thank you. In the
Hello.
meantime, hi.
Actually,
Oh,
Yeah.
I asked
it's
for
supposed to
two
be on
books.
everyone, right?
What is the other one?
The other one, if you have a lot of money, you can buy the one from Arne is good.
Who?
Arne.
Only.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually,
A
I went. I came back from the ETS in Boston and also attend the Society of Biblical Literature. You know,
okay.
I was very impressed by your presentation because you present a very balanced perspective of the prostitute versus the bride from which is a very good contrast and very much well discussed. But to my surprise, your presentation, your way of thinking, using a visual art, a more descriptive, almost like painting a picture. They already done in two ways. One is that we have a section on drama and movie production for Revelation. And I missed the fun because it was produced in 2016. And on all the theater in AMC in America, I'm now in Boston. However, I didn't catch the time, and we don't have enough supporters. So because of the
Mm,
market, not looking good, so they pulled down the show only one day and then gone. And then I was looking for it probably up to Netflix. The other one, I also talked to one of your common friend. I'm Paul, Ian Paul.
okay.
He's a Tyndale guy.
Yep.
Writing the
Yep.
commentary. But you're absolutely right. Right now the commentary is so expensive. Everybody look for a grad a bill, graduate bill, and it already right up to 92 US dollar.
Mhm,
Doesn't
mhm,
mean that we don't have enough money to buy it, but $92 for a commentary this day is considered to be on the little bit on the high end.
mhm,
And I wonder, everybody read the Bauckham, the Theology of Revelation, almost like classic, and
mhm.
you recommend the kind of introductory, but in a full scale commentary, say, I pull out from my shell every day if I do Revelation. So what two, you know, today you would, pull out or you would purchase on your bookshelf?
I would still go with Arne just for completeness. I'm impressed by his completeness. How
Oh, you mean
complete
David Ahn?
David Arne, yeah.
Oh, David Ahn. Okay.
AUN, yeah, AUNE.
Oh, yeah,
Right,
David Ahn, and
right.
I like Robert Barnes.
Okay,
Very
yep.
very
His is
pastoral.
more abbreviated.
Yeah,
Yeah, his is
very
more
pastoral.
abbreviated.
Sometimes I'm not doing my hiding in the basement doing my, but when you preach or helping other people in the Sunday school. So Robert Barnes, the Revelation is one of my favorite. And then I just put on the order on the Amazon on the Cray Kuster. How you
Okay,
like
yep.
Cray Kuster?
I like I have some citations on him in my
Yeah,
commentary
right,
as
right.
well.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think we are on the same ground.
The
And
Kester is good.
yeah, thank you so much. And I was your class, not classmate. I was a schoolmate. You forgot me. From the Portland, Oregon, the Western Baptist
Oh, no
Seminary.
kidding.
And then you went to Sheffield, and then I go in the opposite direction. I went to Harvard Divinity School.
No way.
So
Wow.
when you
Oh.
graduate, and then I went to medical school. So I should tell
Oh,
you more
Okay.
later. Thank you.
all right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your question because you have led Dr. Sam Sang to share some important resources with us. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you.
Do we have any more New Testament questions? Otherwise, I will pivot back to the Old Testament questions because we have two good ones on the Zoom chat, on our Zoom chat.
I have a
Going one?
quick word, just a quick
Yeah,
word, right?
sure.
Let me type in three other scholars in case you guys are interested in how people use ekphrasis in biblical studies. Lynn Huber, Robin Whitaker applied it to Revelation. Harry O'Meara came up with the same idea at the same time I was in the Chinese
Mhm.
world. He's Canadian, very nice guy. He's applied it to various other writings besides the New Testament. So his work is all very interesting. So when you see him broadly apply it, then you say, hey, it's not limited to Revelation, because a lot of people get this impression from my presentation. I'm limiting it to Revelation. I'm by no means doing that.
Right. Thank you
That's
so
it.
much for
Thank
these
you.
citations. Thank you. Well, then let me pivot back to the Old Testament. So from Dr. Sam Sang to Dr. Seow. Thank you, Dr. Seow, for an intriguing closed reading of the book of Job. I noticed that your reading leans towards a closed rhetorical reading and intertextual reading with other Hebrew Bible passages, example Psalm 8. But I'm sure you've also compared Job with other ancient Near Eastern writings. And what suggestions do you make if one wants to do a comparative study? Where do you usually look for such a study, and what ancient Near Eastern works would you compare it with?
Okay, thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for your paper and for your question. Yes, I obviously have done a lot of work on background. So who've heard my other lectures know that I say consequences. I mean, from the very beginning, uh, so it goes really beyond biblical texts. So there are some pious sufferer texts in ancient Near East, Sumerian, one Sumerian and four Akkadian texts. So those do not make any contribution on this issue of the worm or maggot. So ancient Near East texts are hard to do because there are really no um, difficult to search for information. I mean, the old classic is, in the ancient Near Eastern text by Pritchard. Now dated. The only way to get a hold of it is to read a lot. So I started off by reading that stuff over and over again until it's sort of in my head. But really, the way to become familiar with ancient Near Eastern text is just to read and to read in in original if possible, if not in translation. There are no easy way to search those things. So when I work on Job, I look for texts that are analogous, but I'm sure I've missed others. So there's no easy way to search for them, unfortunately. Well, one possible way, though, one possible way, though it's not very efficient, um, the Context of Scripture by William Harlow, 4 volumes,
Oh,
uh, is searchable. So the electronic
good.
versions, they're searchable, and you can do
Mhm.
searches in English.
Yep.
That's not adequate because a lot of terms are not English translations do not always convey the
Yep.
full range of meanings of the original Akkadian, Sumerian, Egyptian, and so forth. But that's a place to start.
Okay.
If you're on those searches, that's a place to start. Look at ANET, an electronic version. Nowadays, you can find those. And Context of Scripture, COS, 4 volumes by William Harlow. That,
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm
Does
familiar
that
with
answer your question,
Annette.
Sam? Yeah.
Yeah, but I am also familiar with William Hollow. I didn't think about that. Thank you for that.
And a second question from Dr. Anthony Loke. I always have problems with patristic allegorizing or spiritualizing way of interpretation. I don't think I get to the point of trying to interpret Christ as the worm or bait to hook the Leviathan or devil, although allegorizing was one of the ways to interpret a text in the past. Some people still do that today. So, where do we draw the line of allegorizing a text since patristic fathers used that method of interpretation?
hmm So my point of citing those is not to um, particularly highlight those approaches, it is to contrast the value that some readers have of the text with what modern scholars do with Bildad. We need to draw that contrast. But I would also suggest, though, that I would not dismiss what we call allegories right away, because very often, they they they're they can be very insightful. We may not draw the same conclusions, but it can often be insightful because the literal meaning of the text, is yeah. If we focus on the literal meaning of text, that's too limited. Sometimes texts mean more than what they say. They mean more, and so figurative interpretation. Origin was the one who did more of this than anybody. He was the one who pioneered the figurative approach. There are many terms for it, and very often they can be insightful. Um, Not in this case. The one hint of of what I think about those texts is that a line I mentioned in passing. Julian of Aclanum, I said he's on a mark. He's on a mark in this regard, but Augustine's reading becomes the dominant Orthodox reading. That was my one passing remark on that. But my point is that this text that have been central for Christian theology, ironically, Christian scholars, especially conservative ones, now go the opposite direction and dismiss Buddha altogether. So what I try to do is invite the conversation. And I think that my critique of the other approaches is evident in my reading of the text. You can tell from my reading of the text what I think really of the other readings. I don't dismiss them, but yeah, the close reading is what I'm trying to highlight, um, how I understand the text. Yeah, by my close reading. Does that answer your question, Anthony? Is there something else?
Can I make a quick comment?
Yes, please.
I train as a medical doctor, MD, so I look into the skin disease of and I find it very interesting, inconsistent with your description with the worm and maggot. I very admire to take the courage to study the book of Job, because Job, the Hebrew is the very archaic and very difficult to understand, and some of the meaning are not easily relocated, and to my funny joke is that actually the Job is more ekphrastic compared to the book of Revelation. But the book of Revelation is not poetic, but in the book of Job is mostly poetic, and the word ekphrastic, they have a very strong dominant genre is referred to poetry. So actually, you do a very ekphrastic description of the worm, maggot, deterioration, and why I spend time on that kind of quote unquote reductionistic, study on the skin disease of Job, because I find out through this understanding, I admire, Job is had a resilience, but his friends are so good. Think about if I have a infectious disease, I can communicate to you. With boils, how do I know it's infectious? Because when you have boil, you mean bacteria. And also in one of the verse, you find that it was described Job's skin was beckoned. What's beckoned? In modern medicine term is gangrene, already dead. So actually, why Joe so fear and frightened, because he know that he's going to die physically because of his skin disease getting worse over time. Okay, and that kind of infectious, ugly looking, whatever you describe it, ekphrastic, and the three friends, the other friends, the four friends, come to Job, they close together and just sit beside him. And that is the true friendship. We call, a friend in need is a friend indeed.
Yeah, so there are a lot of studies on Job's medical condition. Medical doctors written on it. Job's condition has been diagnosed, from elephantiasis to leprosy to worms and so forth. There's a whole body of literature on that.
I know.
And really, yeah. So they find Job's symptoms all over the place. Now here's one problem with the literal reading. We find all these symptoms and we try to put them together to diagnose Job. Whereas the exact illness is really irrelevant to the story. Yeah.
I
So I,
agree.
I, I so
It's
yeah. So
not the
I
right
don't
way
use the
of
term ekphrasis,
hermeneutics.
but I use metaphor a lot. I refer to metaphor a lot, and poetry, and literary ambiguity. And I also do iconography exegesis, comparing Job with what we know from ancient Eastern iconography. Yeah.
Yep. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry that we've overrun time, but thank you so much for all these questions. And I wish we had more time with our three professors who are here today. But Dr. Seow is currently at STM, and then Dr. Sam will be here soon, and Dr. Elaine is here with us. So feel free to drop by our campus, especially this coming Wednesday. We have a public lecture and Dr. Seow is the speaker, and it is the last lecture on the whirlwind speeches. And the topic is speaking rightly as the Lord's servant. It is on Wednesday this week, a day after tomorrow, 8 to 10 p.m. So feel free to join us either on Zoom or in person, and feel free to chat up Dr. Seow when you come in for the talk. Yeah, and for those of you who are interested in the Chinese version of the Biblical Studies Seminar, that is also today at 2 p.m. And I believe it is the same Zoom link. So if you are in for a Chinese session, please join us again. And of course, the topics are different, but it's in the poster that we have sent out. And I think on this note, we will draw this session to a close. Yes, this session is recorded, and you can email us for the recording if necessary. Oh, there we go. There's a link here. Thank you so much. Yeah. For now, we will draw the session to a close, and we invite Dr. Elaine Goh to close the session.
Okay, let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this platform where participants, scholars, students from all over the world, even within Malaysia, can participate, can join, and can learn from this biblical study seminar. We we pray and ask for more interactions. We wish to have more time, but also we need to have we need to gain more insights from our readings and research as well. We pray that Lord, these biblical study seminars will encourage us in one way or another to do further biblical studies and also to engage in scholarship, scholarly dialogues, in order that we not only preach your word, we also exegete, analyze your words to a greater insight. We pray for, we thank you for those presenters and also respondents and also questions, inquiries, interactions among the students and the scholars. We uh, we hope for we hope for the same guidance for the afternoon Chinese sessions. And we also pray for our future biblical study seminars. In the name of Jesus, we give thanks. Amen.
Thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to meeting you again in the next Biblical Studies seminar. Thank you. Goodbye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Ian.
Have a good
Thank
day. Bye bye.
Thank
you.
you, Dr. Xiao and Dr. Sam.
Yes.
Thank you.